Hello, everyone. Welcome to Ascentria Foster Care's 5 Facts About Refugee Foster Care webinar. You are in the right place if that's what you came to hear. We are just going to give people another minute to log on as we do start at 6 sharp. So thank you for those that are here already. And if you want to do yourself a little quick tour of the control panel on your screen, if this is your first time joining a webinar of this kind, right on the right-hand side of your screen, there should be a control panel. You'll notice that you are automatically muted and your video is off for this webinar. We will only be having the staff speak just to make sure we keep to our 30-minute time frame. But we do want to hear from you through the chat and with questions. So we will be having time for questions at the end of the webinar. So in that control panel towards the bottom, you'll see the chat feature, which is where you can enter your questions and send those in for us to see. So that's a quick tour of the control panel in front of you. And I see more people are joining in. So I think we should get started. So hello, everyone. Welcome again to our special webinar topic, the 5 Facts About Refugee Foster Care. My name is Colleen, and I am the Community Outreach Manager at Ascentria Children and Family Services in Massachusetts. Ascentria, if you're not familiar with us, used to be known as Lutheran Social Services, and it's one of the largest human services agencies in New England. We're in all of the New England states except for Rhode Island, and we have a wide variety of services ranging from services for new Americans, immigration legal assistance programs, services for the elderly through our skilled nursing facilities, in-home care services and services for adults with disabilities. And then, of course, what we'll be talking about today is one of our foster care programs, specifically our unaccompanied refugee minors program, which is the only of its kind in all of New England, operating in Massachusetts. So that's a little bit about Ascentria. So let's take a look at our agenda for this evening. Over here, we have introductions. So I have one other staff with me on the call who will introduce herself. And then, of course, we're going to talk about these 5 facts that we want you to know about refugee and immigrant foster care. And then finally, there will be time for Q&A in the last 5 to 10 minutes. So if you're new to this platform, I'll say again that you are automatically muted and we cannot see your video. We are just having our panelists speak tonight to keep to our time since it's a brief 30-minute webinar. But we do want to hear from you in the chat, so please feel free to send in your questions over in your control panel towards the bottom is where you can do that. So send us a message, send us your questions, and we will make sure to get to them. All right. So here are our introductions. So I mentioned I'm Colleen. I've been with Ascentria for 4 years, and I started out working with our unaccompanied refugee minors program. But since then, about 2 years ago, my role expanded to work with all of our foster care programs. We do also have an intensive foster care program that's a domestic foster care program as well. So I work with that. And I introduced Ascentria already, but our mission statement is up there for those of you who are interested. As you can imagine, you know, we are trying to help our communities thrive. It's a very broad mission statement, but that is what encompasses all of the different wonderful programs that we have. And now, Anik, feel free to introduce yourself.
Hello, everyone. My name is Anik Uwineza. I am a foster parent recruiter for Ascentria, unaccompanied refugee minors. I work with Colleen. It's nice being here. I have been working for Ascentria since March 2022. I almost said March this year, but I remembered we're in a new year. So March 2022.
Great. Yeah, thank you all for being here. Thank you, Anik, for joining us. And Yeah, without further ado, we will get started. I'm going to start us off with our first few facts about refugee foster care. So the first fact that we wanted to share with you is the term unaccompanied refugee minor. So that is a mouthful. So we often say URM, the acronym for unaccompanied refugee minors. And that's the name of our program that serves refugees and immigrants with foster care. So a unaccompanied refugee minor is a child, typically an adolescent, that has come to the United States prior to their 18th birthday without a parent or guardian to care for them. So that is what that term unaccompanied means. Our youth are in the United States but do not have a parent or other type of relative that's able to care for them. So with that being said, our youth can have one of a few different types of legal statuses that make them eligible for a program like ours. And by the way, there's only about a dozen of programs for unaccompanied refugee minors across the country. So this is not in every state. So we're very fortunate and very proud at Ascentria to have the only program in Massachusetts serving this unique population of refugee and immigrant youth with foster care. And we are partnered with the national agency, Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service, in order to do this work. So yeah, if you live in Massachusetts, you're fortunate to be able to access this type of program if you are interested in fostering this unique group of youth. But as I was saying, there are different statuses that our youth have. So one of those is, of course, that term refugee that's in the title of our program. And a refugee is a person that's been legally designated by the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees as a refugee. So they must meet that legal definition, having been persecuted and having a well-founded fear for their life due to persecution over their religion, their ethnicity, belonging to a particular social group. So for those youth, we do have youth coming from overseas. We've recently had a youth come from overseas from Burma, also known as Myanmar. And in the past, we've served a lot of youth from Eritrea or Democratic Republic of the Congo. So very diverse group of youth that might have that refugee status. Other statuses would encompass our immigrant youth that have typically come across the US-Mexico border. So we have a lot of youth from Central American countries like Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador. We even have youth that have come all the way from Ghana to the US-Mexico border. So those youth are fleeing dangerous circumstances, whether it's extreme poverty, gang violence, it could be fleeing abuse or neglect by a caregiver, bringing them to migrate to the United States. And those youth could have a status of asylee, special immigrant juvenile, or a victim of trafficking. So I do like to introduce those legal statuses because I know people have lots of questions about that. But I like to also say that I don't think it's super important that you know all the legal statuses. We're not immigration attorneys here, though our youth are provided with one. So you don't have to be an expert on those statuses, but I think it is helpful to know, all of our youth are fleeing dangerous circumstances and have experienced trauma. And that's important when we're caring for these youth to keep in mind their trauma history and have that trauma-informed lens when we're caring for them. So that is our first fact. So it's one fact, but 1,000 questions that might come up for that. So definitely feel free to start entering your questions into that chat and we'll be sure to get to them. But moving on, our second fact, you might notice that when I talk about our kids, I use the term youth more so than child. And that's because our kiddos are typically ages 15 and up when they arrive to our program. It is extremely rare for a youth to be under the age of 13 in our care. And if you think about a youth coming to the United States unaccompanied, without a parent or a guardian, that does tend to be an older youth that is making that journey or who's put into that type of situation. And so that is the reality for serving this population. So if you're interested in potentially caring for an unaccompanied refugee minor, an immigrant refugee youth, you do have to be open-minded to working with adolescents. Another demographic that's interesting to be aware of is about 70% of our youth are male, and about 25 to 30% are female. So again, interesting to see kind of how those demographics play out. So we're definitely looking for people who are open-minded to that demographic. Unfortunately, if you are really looking to foster much younger, younger than 12, and toddlers or elementary school aged children, this program just wouldn't be a fit for you. And unfortunately, you might not be able to serve immigrant and refugee youth as a foster parent if you're not open to older kids. But there are other foster care programs out there with youngsters that we'd be happy to refer you to as well. So if that's the case, feel free to still let us know. Okay. And the last fact that I'll cover before I turn it over to Anik is that our program provides long-term foster care. So when we think about domestic foster care, the Department of Children and Families in Massachusetts, we are partnered with them, with DCF, but obviously we're serving a group of immigrant youth that are coming from very different circumstances than local children. So when we think about local foster care in our state, we tend to think of something shorter term as the youth or child works towards reunification with a relative or a parent. And unfortunately for our kids, reunification is usually not a possibility. They have already typically exhausted that possibility before they come to our program. So immigration officials do seek to find if there's any relatives that the child could reunify with or be sponsored by when they come to the US. And for the kids that come to our program, that doesn't tend to be the case. So for that reason, our kids are in the program long term. So if you think about a young person coming when they're 15 or 16, they're going to be with that foster home for a few years. But another important point I'll make with that is with our kids coming at 16, fortunately, it's not as though they have to leave our program at age 18. So because we're partnered with the Massachusetts Department of Children and Families, DCF, our children are in DCF custody and essentially have the same rights as a foster child in Massachusetts. And in Massachusetts, a foster youth who turns 18 can sign themselves into care voluntarily. So it is up to them if they would like to continue receiving services and supports from Ascentria's URM program. And the vast majority of our youth do choose to do that and sign in at 18, as they are still working towards several of their goals at that point. So we have actually about 70% of our clients served are actually 18 and older. So a lot of kids who are 18 to 22 and working to complete high school, maybe start their first job, get their driver's license, all of those exciting things as they are in their foster homes. So that is the last fact that I will review, and now I can turn it over to you, Anik, and switch over to fact 4.
Thank you, Colleen. Everyone, I apologize if you hear baby noises in the background while I'm talking. So I'll start with the fact number 4. Our URM youth are thriving toward the goal of independence. And that means that when they are in foster care, they are working on developing independent skills. They go to school. Most of them are in high school when they get in foster care, but they might have the goal to go to college after that, so they can start working on finding colleges, learning how to do financial aid, finding scholarships for themselves. They also learn how to prepare meals, how to save money. They can learn how to drive. They can learn how to pay some bills. Maybe they can start with paying like their phone bill, for example, just so when they turn 22 and get in their own apartment, they know how to do those things. They may learn how to make their own medical appointment instead of the foster parent always calling to make their doctor appointment or taking them places. They can transition from being dropped off to taking themselves to the bus stop and get on a bus and go somewhere. So all those small things and all those years they spend in the foster home, they get prepared, and by the time they're out and living on their own, they have all those necessary skills. You can move on to the fifth. The fifth fact is that we need foster parents of all kinds. We do not discriminate any applicants based on their sex, religion, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, or sexual expression. We welcome everyone. You just have to be understanding and have respect for the youth that will come to your home. If they have different religion than yours, you just have to be supportive of that. And if they need your help finding, let's say, if you have a youth who is Muslim and you're not, you can help them find the mosque close by or other organizations that might be helpful for them. You don't have to practice any religion. You don't have to own your own house. You can rent, and we'll still have you as a foster parent as long as you have an extra room or enough space to accommodate a youth. Yeah, you also don't have to be making a lot of money. You can have any job. You just have to make enough money to support your family without needing assistance from our agency, even though you will end up getting a reimbursement when you have a youth in your home, but it won't be a payment. So we expect parents to be making some money of their own, but you don't need a lot to become a foster parent. You just need a good heart and everything will work out. So that's the last one. I don't know if anyone has questions, and you're free to ask.
Great. Thank you, Anik. Yeah, and I'll just add to this, we think that this is probably the most important fact for you to take away is that there's a dire need for foster parents for this population. Unfortunately, last year in 2022, our program experienced a 70% decline in the number of people inquiring and learning about this program as compared to 2021, where we had a lot of interest. So I'm not really sure what's causing this significant decrease, but to essentially have 1/4 of the number of people interested in applying has been really drastic shift for us. And the need is great. I mean, all the time we do hear in the news about the border crisis and the record-breaking number of migrants that are entering the United States. There's thousands of unaccompanied children at the border, so the need is potentially endless. Our goal each year is to license at least 12 new foster parents to care for our youth, but really, I mean, we would love to even go beyond that and license 20 in a year. So if you or anyone that you know might have a heart that's being called to this type of immigrant and refugee foster care, we would love to hear from you. After today, you will be receiving an email with the recording of tonight's webinar. So you're welcome to share that with friends, maybe watch it as a group at a Bible study or church. Even if you yourself cannot be a foster parent, one of the greatest ways that you can help us is to spread the word. We really believe that word of mouth in the community and just telling people about this program is powerful and does help our kids in the long term. I think not a lot of people realize that this type of foster care exists. So tell people and just become an advocate for this type of foster care. So if that's something of interest to anyone, then definitely let us know. So you'll get all of our contact info after today. And yeah, that will come tomorrow. So look forward to that email. And as Anik said, we'll open up now with our last 10 minutes for questions. I do see that Debbie has her hand raised, but the best way for you to ask your question is to enter it in the meeting chat. So if you go down towards the bottom of your control panel, you should be able to send us in your question. And we would love to see what you'd like to know. And I just sent a message in the chat just in case that helps anyone find it. And I'll just give people a couple minutes. I know we threw a lot of information at you really quickly, so I'll give people time to type in their questions. Okay, one question is, are URM minors ever able to be adopted? So this is a very common question that we do get. And when we go back to talking about our, let's see, our fourth fact, I'll say that this is not typically a goal for our youth to work towards adoption. We did just have an adoption this month, but that was the first time our programs had an adoption in 4 years. So it's about 1% or less of our youth that end up being adopted. So for most of our youth, as Anik was talking about, they're striving towards the goal of independence. And that's actually a goal that is set by the Department of Children and Families. Other goals in foster care are things like reunification, adoption, guardianship. Because of the ages of our youth, they have a really big say in what that goal is. And most of our kids are really wanting to build towards independence. Most of them do have parents that are still living back in home country that they are in touch with. So a formal adoption might not feel right for them. But I do think because we're a long-term foster care program, really they become a part of their foster family through an informal adoption, right? Just an adoption of the heart, if you will. Because oftentimes the foster parents are the only people that the child really knows in the United States, or at least in Massachusetts oftentimes. So they really do become the youth's family, even if that's not through, a formal legal process. So thank you for that question. We do have another question here. What percentage of youth are legally allowed to work? So very good question. I'll start by noting that all of our kids do have an immigration attorney working with their case that is provided at no cost to the youth or to the parent, the foster parent. It is provided for by Ascentria. We do have our own Ascentria attorneys that work with the youth, and we also contract out with some other attorneys in Boston. And so depending on the youth's legal status, initially, they may not be able to work. So our youth who are refugees and asylees, they are immediately eligible to work. But at this point, that's probably only about 40% of our kids who are arriving immediately able to work with those statuses. The remainder of our youth are mostly special immigrant juveniles and victims of trafficking. So I would say at least 60% of kids are arriving with those statuses. Those statuses do not come with work authorization. So our youth would not be able to work until they get that work authorization and then also eventually their green card. So that process can take a few years before youth are able to legally work. So great question. Hopefully I answered that well. Another question, how much say does the foster family have in what country they take a youth from? So that they absolutely do have a say. During our home study process, there is a process for a foster parent to become licensed. There's an application, a background check, home visits, and a training. And then finally a home study where home visits continue and a social worker is really getting to know the family. So during that time, that's when those types of conversations have about what type of a youth would be the best match for the family. What type of needs can the family support? Does the family speak any other languages? That might be a cultural match for youth. So we absolutely want to set families up for success, and you know your family best. So we want to take into consideration your comfort levels and your preferences and your strengths. But you know, we do have to be realistic about our population of youth. And so we would definitely make sure, just in our initial conversations with you, that the countries of origin where our kids are commonly coming from at this time is something you're open to. So for right now, we're looking for families that are open to caring for children from Central America and the Middle East primarily, especially Afghanistan. So our program population is really dependent on world events and migration events in the world. So if we think about Afghanistan, in over a year, the US withdrawal, many migrants got on planes and came from Afghanistan on humanitarian parole to our country, including unaccompanied minors. So a lot of youth from Afghanistan, as well as a lot of youth from Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. So those are the primary countries at this time. All right. And another question, are there ever sibling pairs? Anik, do you want to speak to that question?
What was the question again? I can't really see it.
Oh, yep. Are there siblings?
Oh, yes. Yes, sometimes there are youth who come as siblings, and when that happens, we prefer putting them in the same home so they can be each other's support system. Yeah.
Great. Yeah, I would say for that, there's probably like a quarter of youth that have a sibling with them. It's not super common, not as common in like local Massachusetts foster care. I would say all of our youth probably have siblings. They might just not be in the country with the youth. And yeah, so just to add to that, Anik. Okay. And then another question is, do any of the youth from Afghanistan speak any English? And I'll even broaden that question just for all of our youth, whether they speak English. Anik, did you want to speak to that?
Yes. Some of them might speak some English. They might have been going to school in their home countries before they come to the United States, and English might be one of the languages spoken in their countries. So I have never met one youth from Afghanistan, but I believe some of them come speaking English at some extent, but not all of them.
Yeah, and so just to add to that, I would say all of the youth in our program are English language learners at different levels, regardless of what country that they come from. And so I would say a lot of our youth right now that are arriving do not speak any English. That's been the current experience. And I think, you know, when we think about the population being served, we haven't had as many refugee arrivals from overseas in recent years because of the pandemic and all these different complications in the world today. And, you know, refugees coming from overseas, they would possibly have received a little bit more preparation for coming to the United States and being resettled in the United States. Maybe even a tiny bit of schooling in their refugee camp settings. However, you know, for youth from Afghanistan, it was a very, very different situation. You know, that was like an overnight thing that happened where one day they were with their parents and they were going to school and they had their routine, and the next day they got on a plane and fled. So very different situation. So it can really depend on the individual youth and their story and what they've experienced. So I would say that basically every child is different. We have some youth who are able to obtain transcripts from their home country and skip straight ahead to senior year. So it can really depend on the youth. Okay. Lots of great questions. So thank you so much for these questions. And then it looks like we have a comment. I'm working with 2 families from Afghanistan and they speak Pashto and Dari. It is almost impossible to find a translator, whereas if Spanish is their language, it's very easy to find services. Absolutely, and that's from Debbie. Thank you, Debbie. And it's amazing. I'm betting that you are one of our wonderful neighborhood support team volunteers. So thank you for already serving Ascentria in that capacity. It is true that youth from Afghanistan speak those same languages you're familiar with in our program, Dari and Pashto. We've actually been really fortunate that because we're dealing with minors, one of our programs received funding to hire a Dari and Pashto interpreter that like basically become like a remote member of our staff. So that was really incredible. I believe he's wrapping up his service with our program right now, so we're going to miss him as he transitions away. So the youth are rapidly working to learn English, but we were fortunate to have that interpreter available as the youth were arriving. We also have, you know, just different connections in the community, and even not for formal appointments, but just for the youth to have connection to speak their language. We do try to connect our youth that, even if they're not siblings, we do try to connect them to one another if they speak the same language so that they have the opportunity to do that together. But definitely the language barrier can be a challenge. You know, prior to the pandemic, the majority of our youth were coming from Eritrea and they speak Tigrinya, which isn't a language before I worked here that I had ever heard of. I think a lot of Americans are naive to Tigrinya, right? And so I think there was only a handful of interpreters for that language. So our program is definitely familiar with kind of navigating those tricky language barriers and finding those solutions. But absolutely, our young people who speak those unique languages, it's exhausting and a challenge, but they are forced to learn English pretty quickly, which hopefully in the long run is to their benefit as they start, you know, working towards college or working. Okay, so with that, we've reached our time here. So thank you all so much for your time, for your attention, for your questions. This, as I mentioned, has been recorded, so we will send out an email tomorrow with the recording and some follow-up information. If you'd like to learn more, we would be happy just to talk over the phone with you one-on-one. Even if you're not sure how you can help, we would love to navigate that with you, whether it's becoming a foster parent, a volunteer, a donor. There's a lot of ways you can get involved and help our youth. So thank you again for your time. Thank you, Anik, for being here as well. And yeah, I hope you all have a wonderful evening and wishing you all a happy and healthy 2023.